The Assembly of First Nations is calling on governments and police forces across the country to review their practices in the wake of a recent death. 26-year-old Chantel Moore was shot and killed Thursday after police were called to her home for a wellness check. As Ross Lord explains, her death is raising more questions about the relationship between Indigenous Canadians and police.
Indigenous leaders from across Canada are demanding answers about Chantel Moore's death. The Edmundston Police Department says an officer called in to conduct a wellness check ended up shooting Moore and killing her. Edmundston police say Moore was holding a knife, confronted the officer, and made threats, an explanation her family rejects.
Chantel was not violent. She was not aggressive. She was not mean. She was very friendly and outgoing.
Maliseet First Nations in New Brunswick are calling for an independent probe of the New Brunswick justice system for what they call systemic discrimination. The Assembly of First Nations is calling for an impartial third-party investigation into why lethal force was used and whether race was a factor. National Chief Perry Bellegarde asks, how does a call for help turn into a call for the coroner? This should never happen. Bellegarde adds all governments should consider whether an armed response without proper social supports and training is ever the correct response to a wellness check. At a time when police tactics are under close scrutiny, Moore's death raises more questions about the relationship between police and people of color.
I've had some clients who've, they've called the police because they themselves were feeling unsafe, but they were met with suspicion or condescension, or they report that they were met with aggression.
A team of investigators from Quebec has been appointed to examine Moore's death. There's an online petition calling for the officer to be charged with murder. A separate fundraising campaign for family travel and funeral costs has raised well over $100,000. Organizers say any remaining proceeds will go to Moore's mother and her 5-year-old daughter, Gracie. Ross Lord, Global News.
An independent investigation has been launched into how RCMP handled the case involving a First Nations leader. Chief Alan Adam claims he was brutally beaten during an arrest over an expired license plate. Our David Akin looks at whether these civilian review agencies can even affect change.
It was this photo, a bruised and bloodied Chief Alan Adam, that factored into the decision to have Alberta's Civilian Police Review Agency
look at my face, I'm bleeding, man.
Investigate how RCMP handled Adam's March 10th arrest after RCMP found an expired license plate sticker on his truck.
But this is one of the clearest cases of unnecessary police brutality.
The review was welcomed as an important first step, but in some parts of the country, Saskatchewan for example, there is no civilian agency that can review complaints about police brutality and racism. The federal RCMP Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, meanwhile, is backlogged with cases, say academic researchers and parliamentarians, though the commission itself disputes that. Nonetheless, it does not have the power to issue orders or compel change. It can only provide recommendations. But Ottawa, for years, has had no shortage of calls for change. Critics say it now needs to act.
That's why I'm calling for really clear policy changes to do something about it. It's not enough to just say the pretty words.
Singh, for example, says police and security agencies should be prohibited from using racial profiling as a policing tool. And the criminal justice system should be revamped to try to reduce the overrepresentation of non-minorities in jail.
We know that some of the mandatory minimums have disproportionately impacted those who are racialized, Indigenous people, Black people. So changing those mandatory minimums to give discretion back to judges.
Academics and MPs also say Ottawa should collect more race-based data because without measuring the problem remains invisible to policymakers.
We need to measure that in everything: access to business loans, access to social services. All those things will be very important and will be a gift that we'll keep on giving to improve the place of reducing anti-Black racism in this country.
Singh and the NDP will use their time in parliamentary proceedings next week to push the government for specific action to identify and fight racism in Canada. Robin?
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David.